August 21st, 1955, ends with 11 people rushing into the Hopkinsville police station, saying strange figures have been appearing around a farmhouse near Kelly, Kentucky. Minutes earlier, armed men at that house had been firing a 20-gauge shotgun and a .22 rifle into the darkness. One reported figure had approached the back door, with raised arms, an oversized head, shining eyes, and claw-like hands. Another, supposedly, appeared at a window soon after the first shots. Someone in the group later said, a claw-like hand reached from the porch overhang and touched Billy Ray Taylor's hair. Behind them, the farmhouse carried evidence that weapons had been fired. Police would return to the property that night. Nothing resembling a strange creature would be recovered. No body turned up. Blood from an unknown animal was not documented. Footprints proving that anything unusual had crossed the yard were never established. Yet, 8 adults and 3 children had been frightened enough to leave the farm and seek help. Why would several people become convinced that something extraordinary was surrounding the house? More importantly, what were the armed men actually shooting at? Decades later, the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter survives because its strongest fact is also its most frustrating one. 11 people really did arrive at the police station in a state contemporary investigators regarded as genuine distress. Local authorities responded, rather than dismissing the story as a joke. Officers found shell casings and gunfire damage, but not an attacker. Project Blue Book later received material connected to the case. Although available accounts indicate the Air Force did not conduct the sweeping field investigation that later retellings sometimes imply. Instead, the mystery lives inside a gap between experience and proof. Something convinced members of this household that they were facing repeated intrusions outside their home. Investigators never established what caused those sightings. Around 7 that evening, Billy Ray Taylor went outside toward the well and reported seeing a bright silvery object cross the sky. Most people inside, apparently, did not take the report seriously. Soon afterward, barking from the family dog drew Taylor and Lucky Sutton outside. If evidence first mysteries are your thing, like the video, subscribe, and support the channel. Consider that our brief tribute to the YouTube algorithm. And now, back to Kelly. There, according to later accounts, Taylor and Sutton saw a short figure approaching, with its arms raised. Taylor grabbed a .22 rifle, while Sutton took a 20-gauge shotgun. Gunfire followed. Witnesses said the figure fell or flipped backward, then disappeared into the darkness. Moments later, another face appeared near a window, prompting more shots through a screen. Glennie Langford later described one of the figures as short, with a large head, small legs, and a bright metallic-looking surface. Following those first reports, members of the household said similar figures appeared again around the house. Back near the porch, Taylor later claimed a claw-like hand reached from above and touched his hair. Others reportedly pulled him back, while more shots were fired. Inside, the family waited, watched the windows, and listened for movement. Just before 11, the group finally left for Hopkinsville. Arriving at the police station changed the case. Before that moment, every extraordinary claim came from people inside the same household. Chief Russell Greenwell now had frightened civilians reporting a prolonged disturbance involving firearms and children. Several local officers, state police, military police from nearby Fort Campbell, and others went back toward the property. Responders searched the house and surrounding area. Searchers found shell casings and damage consistent with gunfire. Crucially, they did not find a creature, body, unusual blood, or convincing trace of a landed craft. At this point, the obvious explanation should have been simple: whatever had been outside was gone. However, that still left the harder question unanswered. What had made these people fire in the first place? Later accounts say the authorities remained for a time and eventually left. Once they were gone, Glennie Langford said one of the figures appeared again, near a window, during the early morning. None of the responding officers witnessed that alleged return. Consequently, the second phase of the story remains a witness claim, rather than independently confirmed evidence. Morning brought more attention, more questions, and eventually, the first layers of mythology, but led with a local radio employee, interviewed adult witnesses, and produced drawings based on their descriptions. Separate interviews later impressed investigator Isabel Davis, because several important features remained similar across accounts. Davis also questioned parts of Billy Ray Taylor's later testimony, believing some details had become more elaborate. That matters, because Taylor supplied both the opening object in the sky and several of the case's most dramatic moments. Memory can preserve an experience while changing its edges. Contemporary coverage demonstrates how quickly those edges moved. Early newspaper reporting turned repeated appearances into a story involving numerous little men, even though the surviving accounts do not establish that a dozen separate beings were ever seen at once. Color shifted too. Initial descriptions centered on silvery, dark, or shining figures, not the bright green goblins that became attached to the case later. National retellings helped merge Kelly with the broader image of little green men. A second mystery had appeared. Why were people remembering a cleaner, stranger version than the earliest record supported? Public attention supplied part of the answer. Crowds began arriving at the property after the story spread through radio and newspapers. Eventually, the family charged visitors for access or information after attempts to keep curiosity seekers away failed. Critics later treated the money as evidence that the event had been staged. Chronology makes that argument less convincing than it first sounds, because the emergency police visit and initial investigation happened before the tourist traffic became a business. Profit may encourage later embellishment, but it does not, by itself, explain the original call for help. Alcohol became another convenient explanation. Some later skeptical accounts suggested that drinking may have influenced the witnesses. Period reports, however, said investigators found no evidence of heavy drinking at the scene. Psychologists Rodney Schmaltz and Scott Lilienfeld later described intoxication only as a possibility for which some evidence existed. Therefore, alcohol cannot honestly be presented as an established answer. Hoax remains possible for a different reason. Staging could explain the absence of exotic physical evidence. Against that idea stands the use of live firearms around a crowded house, the immediate involvement of police, and the lack of demonstrated planning before the event. Furthermore, no surviving evidence identifies costumes, accomplices, props, or a scheme prepared in advance. Sincerity, though, does not prove correct identification. People can be genuinely frightened and genuinely wrong. Now, the investigation reaches the explanation that has survived better than most: great horned owls. Audubon describes the species as large, nocturnal, broad-winged, and equipped with conspicuous ear tufts and yellow eyes. Viewed upright in poor light, an owl can present a large head, little visible neck, powerful talons, and a silhouette that does not immediately read as a familiar bird. Dropping from a branch can briefly create an odd floating impression. Reflective eyes can also appear to glow when illuminated. Compare those traits with the early creature descriptions, and the resemblance becomes difficult to dismiss. Meteor explanations have also been proposed for Taylor's earlier light in the sky, giving the mundane theory two separate parts: one explanation for the aerial sighting, another for the figures. For the first time, the case begins to look less like an alien siege, and more like a chain of ordinary events colliding in exactly the wrong order. Owls account for the shining eyes, clawed feet, squat proportions, tree positions, roofline appearances, and the strange silhouette reported in poor light. Missed gunshots account for the lack of bodies, blood, feathers, or injured animals left behind. Darkness accounts for bad distance estimates, while repeated movement around the same trees and roof could make one or two animals seem like a larger number. His earlier aerial sighting supplies the expectation that whatever appeared later might be connected to something from the sky. Fear then supplies the acceleration, because once armed people believe an unknown creature is outside, every shadow, scrape, and pair of reflected eyes becomes part of the same event. Together, that sequence explains the light, the figures, the repeated returns, the gunfire, the lack of physical remains, and even why everyone involved could be sincere. Suddenly, the mystery appears to collapse. Case closed, except one weakness refuses to disappear. How did several adults in rural Kentucky repeatedly look at what they described as nearby figures, and fail to recognize an owl. Distance at night is notoriously hard to judge when the true size of an object is unknown. Expectation also changes perception. Suppose a bright object has just been reported beyond the trees, the dog begins barking, somebody sees reflective eyes, and armed men step outside, expecting trouble. Ordinary wildlife no longer arrives in an ordinary context. Even so, the owl theory is still a reconstruction, not a recovered animal, with a chain of evidence tying it to the scene. Photographs from that night do not prove an owl was present. Carcass evidence was never recovered. Responding officers never reported catching the supposed culprit sitting on a branch. Plausible is not the same thing as demonstrated. Heavy official response does not strengthen the extraterrestrial case as much as later retellings suggest. Law enforcement had every reason to respond because armed, frightened civilians were firing around a home containing children. Military police from Fort Campbell add drama to the story, but their presence does not show that the military detected a spacecraft. Likewise, Project Blue Book receiving material about Kelly means the case entered the Air Force's UFO records, not that Blue Book verified alien visitors. Available summaries indicate the program did not conduct the kind of extensive on-site investigation sometimes implied in popular versions. Strip away 70 years of retelling, and the case becomes smaller, but more useful. Documented facts leave us with 11 people arriving at a police station, authorities responding, guns having been fired, and no extraordinary target being recovered. Reported details add the strange figures, glowing or shining eyes, apparent floating, repeated returns, and Taylor's claimed contact beneath the porch roof. Speculation adds bulletproof bodies, a precise army of attackers, secret technology, and certainty that a spacecraft landed nearby. Separating those layers does not destroy the mystery. Rather, it reveals the real one. By then, we are no longer investigating only what stood outside the Sutton farmhouse. Beyond asking merely what the witnesses saw, we also have to ask what happened to the story after the witnesses saw it. Original accounts describe something unidentified. Newspapers supplied cleaner numbers and stronger labels. Popular culture supplied green skin and goblins. Skeptics supplied owls and a meteor. Believers supplied extraterrestrial intent. Each layer made the story easier to tell, but not necessarily easier to prove. First among the conventional explanations, the meteor plus owl theory requires the fewest extraordinary assumptions. It accounts reasonably well for the opening light, several physical features of the reported figures, their positions near trees and roof lines, and the lack of recoverable non-human evidence. Second, deliberate hoaxing remains possible, but lacks direct proof of preparation. Third, intoxication may have affected someone, yet the evidence is too weak to explain the entire event. Fourth, escaped monkeys, secret experiments, and similar rescue theories have not produced persuasive documentation tied to that night. Finally, extraterrestrial visitation takes the witness interpretation literally, while demanding evidence the case does not provide. Taken together, the most reasonable reconstruction is ordinary causes, amplified by extraordinary circumstances. Priming from Taylor's aerial sighting, unfamiliar nocturnal animals, darkness, fear, and repeated gunfire could have transformed uncertain observations into a shared conviction that the house was under attack. Officials responded because the people involved were armed and frightened, regardless of whether the threat was animal, imagined, misidentified, or something else. Contradictions multiplied because memories changed, headlines simplified the event, and later retellings preserved the most memorable details. Folklore kept Kelly alive because an unresolved night with armed witnesses, police, bizarre drawings, and no recovered culprit is almost designed to survive. Hardest to explain is not why no alien body was found. Multiple adults remained convinced that they had seen something unfamiliar at relatively close range, and their fear was serious enough to bring them to the police. Forensics cannot tell us what those reported figures actually were. Surviving records cannot reconstruct every angle, distance, shadow shot, and sightline from that night. Maybe the answer really was sitting in a tree. Perhaps a meteor and a pair of owls were enough to start a chain reaction that nobody inside the farmhouse could recognize while it was happening. Still, the evidence cannot take us back into that yard and identify the exact target. Ultimately, what were they actually shooting at? This question survived the police search, the newspapers, Project Blue Book, the skeptics, the believers, and decades of retelling. Possibly, there is a simple answer, and perhaps we have already heard most of it. Until evidence can bridge the distance between what those witnesses reported and what investigators actually found, Kelly remains explainable in parts, persuasive in none, and unresolved at the one point that matters most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next file.